The iron cage baked under the merciless Arizona sun, its black bars searing hot enough to brand flesh. Sister Agnes pressed her weathered hands against the metal and felt the heat pierce through her torn gray habit like burning needles. Beside her, Sister Miriam threw her own body against the bars as another rock crashed toward them, her young arms spread wide to shield her mentor from the mob's fury. "Get away from her, child," Agnes whispered, but Miriam held her ground, blood trickling from where a jagged stone had opened her scalp. "I won't let them hurt you." The younger nun declared, her voice trembling but resolute. At 22, Miriam still believed in the fundamental goodness of humanity, still thought that courage and faith could triumph over hatred. Agnes closed her eyes against a memory that had haunted her for 24 years, Chicago, 1862. The smell of carbolic acid and gangrene, thick in the Union Field Hospital. Her brother Thomas lying on a blood-soaked cot, his blue uniform dark with infection, his eyes already glazing with the approach of death. "Margaret," he had whispered through cracked lips, using her real name, the name she had buried beneath layers of guilt and false identity. "Don't let me die in this godforsaken place. I'm all you have left in this world." The memory shattered as Reverend Silas Crane's voice boomed across Dust Haven's town square, his black coat billowing like raven wings in the desert wind. The leather-bound Bible in his hands was stained dark with what looked suspiciously like dried blood, whether from previous judgments or something more sinister Agnes didn't want to know. Non-consorters with devils. Crane shrieked, his pale eyes blazing with fanatic fire. Betrayers of the white race. These false sisters have chosen the red savage over the Christian soul. The crowd pressed closer, their faces twisted with righteous fury. Agnes saw people she had treated ranchers, whose bones she had set children, whose fevers she had broken, women whose babies she had delivered. But hatred had transformed them into something unrecognizable, their eyes bright with bloodlust that seemed to feed on itself. "Sister Agnes saved my baby from the croup," called out a woman near the back of the crowd. But her voice was drowned by the roar of the mob, and Agnes saw her quickly pulled back by neighbors who wanted no dissent from the prevailing madness. "The Lord demands justice." Crane continued, spittle flying from his thin lips. "These servants of Satan have made themselves enemies of God and man. They have blessed Apache weapons with holy water. They have given our military secrets to red devils who scalp Christian children." None of it was true. But truth had become a casualty in Crane's holy war. Agnes felt bile rise in her throat as she watched children barely old enough to understand the words they were screaming, and their young faces contorted with learned hatred. Beyond the mob's edge, where the desert began its endless sprawl toward blood-red mesas, shadows moved among the creosote and Palo Verde. Apache eyes watched from beneath painted brows, and eagle feathers, their bodies motionless as the rocks themselves. But Agnes could feel their presence like heat lightning before a storm. Naiche stood among the ancient stones, his weathered face carved from granite, his hand resting on the hilt of a knife that had tasted white man's blood. At 32, the Chiricahua war chief had buried too many of his people, his wife and infant son, to cavalry bullets 3 years past his father, to white man's disease, his ancestral hunting grounds to white man's law, backed by rifles. The desert had made him hard as flint, but something in those two caged women called to the ember of honor that still burned in his warrior's heart. "They will not die," he whispered to the wind, his voice carrying the weight of a blood oath. "Not while Apache breath fills Apache lungs." Behind him, Broken Arrow spat tobacco juice into the dust, his scarred face bearing the permanent scowl of a man who had learned to trust no white eyes. The war leader's left hand was missing 2 fingers lost to a cavalry saber at Apache Pass, and his eyes held the cold calculation of someone who had survived by expecting betrayal. "They are not our people, brother," he said, his voice rough as granite. "Why should Apache blood be spilled for white women's foolishness?" Let the white eyes kill their own. It saves us the trouble. Because they spilled their own blood for Apache children. Naiche replied, his dark gaze never leaving the cage. The gray-haired one, she pulled the bullet from Little Hawk's chest when our own medicine could not save him. The young one held moon. That rises while the fever burned, sang to her in the white man's tongue. Honor demands honor. Mercy calls to mercy. Swift Eagle, barely 20 but already carrying the scars of 5 raids, shifted restlessly beside them. Honor is a luxury we cannot afford, he said, his young voice tight with suppressed violence. Every day we wait, more of our people die on reservations. Every day we show mercy, the white eyes grow stronger. Maybe it's time to let them hang their own saints and learn what cruelty truly means. Naiche studied the young warrior's face, seeing his own rage and frustration reflected there. Swift Eagle had lost his entire family to a cavalry raid. 2 winters passed, parents, sisters, even the girl he had planned to marry, all cut down while trying to flee to Mexico. The boy's hatred burned pure and cold, uncomplicated by the moral calculations that plagued older men. And what of Little Hawk? Naiche asked quietly. What of Moon that rises and the dozen other Apache children who live because those women chose healing over safety? Do we abandon honor because it has become inconvenient? In the town square, Crane raised his blood-stained Bible toward the pitiless sky. Tomorrow at dawn, these servants of Satan will face the judgment they have earned. Let no man say we are not merciful. We grant them this night to confess their sins and beg forgiveness from the God they have betrayed. The crowd roared approval, but Agnes barely heard them. Her mind was racing backward through the chain of choices that had led to this moment, each decision a link in the shackles that now bound her to this fate. The war. The impossible choice between her brother's life and her duty as a healer. The morphine she had sold to Confederate agents to buy Thomas's freedom from that hellish prison. The Union soldiers who had died because medicine never reached the field hospitals. 24 years of running from Margaret Whitmore. 24 years of trying to wash blood from her hands with good deeds and healing touch. And now it was ending where it had begun, with her life weighed against the lives of others, with mercy and justice balanced on a razor's edge. Sister Agnes, Miriam whispered, her young voice breaking. What are we going to do? Agnes opened her eyes and looked at her companion, idealistic, brave, following a calling that had led her into this desert hell. The girl deserved better than to die for Margaret Whitmore's sins, better than to pay the price for choices made before she was even born. May we pray? Agnes said quietly, her voice steady despite the fear clawing at her throat. We pray for strength to face whatever comes and for forgiveness for those who know not what they do. But even as the words left her lips, Agnes felt the turquoise Thunderbird talisman hidden in her habit's inner pocket, a gift from Naiche after she had saved his nephew's life. The carved stone was warm against her palm, and with it came a memory of dark eyes, filled with gratitude, of a warrior's nod of respect, of hands that could kill without hesitation, but had offered protection instead. The Apache were coming. She could feel it in her bones, in the way the desert wind shifted and whispered secrets among the sage. The question was not whether they would try to save her and Miriam. The question was how many would die in the attempt, and whether their sacrifice would be worth the lives of 2 women who had chosen the wrong side of an impossible war. As the sun began its descent toward the western mountains, painting the sky, the color of fresh blood, Agnes closed her eyes and whispered a prayer for the living and the dead, for the guilty and the innocent, for the choices that bound them all together in this web of violence and grace. The desert wind carried her words away, but somewhere among the rocks and shadows, Apache ears heard them, and Apache hearts prepared to answer with steel and blood, and the kind of courage that could only be born from love. 3 months earlier, Dust Haven had been nothing more than a collection of adobe buildings and false front stores clinging to life in the shadow of the Dragoon Mountains. The town had sprouted like a poison flower on land that had belonged to the Apache for generations, built on promises of silver that never materialized and sustained by cattle ranching that required ever more Apache territory. The mission clinic had been Agnes's sanctuary for 3 years, an adobe building with thick walls that stayed cool in summer and warm in winter. She had arrived with nothing but a worn medical bag and 24 years of guilt, fleeing yet another town where questions about her past had grown too persistent. Sister Miriam had arrived 6 months later, sent by the territorial diocese to assist with the growing medical needs of the frontier. The young nun was everything Agnes was not optimistic, where Agnes was cautious, trusting, where Agnes was suspicious, filled with unshakable faith, where Agnes carried the weight of unforgivable sins. Sister Agnes, Miriam had said on her first night in Dusthaven, as they shared a simple meal of beans and hardtack. "May I ask why you chose this place? Surely your skills would be more appreciated in Tucson or Phoenix." Agnes had looked out the window at the desert, stretching endlessly toward the mountains, its harsh beauty hiding 1,000 different ways to die. "Sometimes we don't choose our destinations, child. Sometimes they choose us." It was the closest she had ever come to telling the truth about Margaret Whitmore, about the morphine sold to Confederate agents, about the Union soldiers who had died for want of medicine that might have saved them. But Miriam had not pressed, and Agnes had been grateful for the gift of silence. The trouble began with Reverend Silas Crane's arrival in late spring, his traveling ministry bringing both hope and division to Dusthaven's dusty streets. Crane was a tall man with piercing blue eyes and a voice that could make stones weep or sinners tremble. But beneath the holy words and righteous fire, Agnes sensed something darker, a rage that went beyond the usual frontier prejudices, personal and venomous. She had seen Crane's type before during the war. Men who had lost everything to violence and wrapped their grief in the flag of divine retribution. Men who had been broken by loss and chose to break others rather than heal themselves. "The Red Devil took my family." Crane had confided to Agnes during one of his visits to the clinic, his pale eyes distant with memory. "My wife Sarah, my 2 young sons. Comanche raiders hit our farm in Texas, burned it to ash while I was away preaching the word of God. I found their bodies 3 days later, scalped and mutilated, left for the buzzards." Agnes had felt genuine sympathy for the man's loss, understanding how grief could curdle into hatred. "I'm sorry for your pain, Reverend. Loss is never easy to bear." But Crane's smile had been cold as winter stone. "Pain, sister? No, you misunderstand. God took my family to teach me a lesson that mercy is weakness, that turning the other cheek only invites the devil's claws. I've learned that lesson well. The red savage understands only one language: violence. It's time the good people of this territory learned to speak it fluently." His sermons reflected that philosophy, drawing crowds from across the territory with promises of divine retribution against Apache devils. Crane's God was a God of vengeance, not mercy, a deity who demanded blood sacrifice and racial purity, who blessed the strong and cursed the weak. The Apache is not merely our enemy. Crane would thunder from his canvas pulpit, sweat streaming down his gaunt face. He is the enemy of civilization itself. God has given us dominion over this land, but we must be willing to cleanse it with holy fire. The congregation would roar its approval, caught up in Crane's fever dream of manifest destiny wrapped in scripture. Donations poured in, not just coins, but cattle land deeds and promises of support for whatever action the Reverend deemed necessary. Agnes tried to avoid Crane's sermons, but his influence was impossible to escape. She began to notice the way people looked at her when she returned from treating Apache patients, the whispered conversations that stopped when she entered a room, the subtle but unmistakable signs of a community turning against its own. The crisis came with the arrival of Little Hawk, 8 years old and burning with fever. The Apache boy had been shot during a cavalry raid on his village, the bullet lodging dangerously close to his heart. His Aunt Yellowbird had carried him through the desert for 2 nights, following rumors of a white woman who healed without asking questions. Agnes had taken one look at the child and known she had perhaps hours to save his life. The surgery was delicate, dangerous, requiring skills she had learned on Civil War battlefields, where such precision often meant the difference between life and death. But she had steady hands and 24 years of experience. And more importantly, she had the will to fight death itself for the sake of one small boy. For 3 days and nights, Agnes battled to keep little Hawk alive. Miriam assisted feeding him drops of willow bark tea and changing blood-soaked bandages, while Agnes monitored his breathing and pulse. On the 4th morning, the boy opened his eyes and smiled, and Agnes felt a moment of pure joy that washed away years of accumulated guilt. But their victory was short-lived. Tom Wild, owner of the largest ranch in the territory, had been watching the clinic with growing suspicion. When he saw Yellowbird leaving with the recovered child, Wild's fury was incandescent. "Whoa. Well," Wild drawled as he cornered Agnes in the clinic that evening, his voice dripping with false courtesy. The rancher was a big man, soft around the middle, but with the hard eyes of someone who had killed for land and would kill again. "Looks like our good sister has been playing nursemaid to Apache brats. I treated a sick child," Agnes replied evenly, her hands continuing to organize her medical supplies. "That's what doctors do." Wild's laugh was ugly as a rattlesnake's hiss. "That's what traitors do, honey. And don't think we don't know what you really are." His hand rested on his gun belt, fingers twitching with barely controlled violence. Margaret Whitmore wasn't a battlefield nurse who sold out her own boys for Confederate gold. Agnes felt ice form in her veins. She had been careful, so careful, but 24 years of running had taught her that the past was never truly buried. "I don't know what you mean." "Sure you don't." Wild's smile was all teeth and malice. "Reverend Crane, he's got connections back east. People who remember the war remember nurses who betrayed their own kind. Funny how these things have a way of catching up to a person." The rancher leaned closer, his breath reeking of whiskey and tobacco. "Now here's what's going to happen, Margaret. You're going to stop treating Apache. You're going to remember which side you're supposed to be on this time. Because if you don't, the whole territory is going to know exactly what kind of woman hides behind that nun's habit." Agnes met his gaze without flinching, drawing on reserves of courage she had thought long depleted. "And if I refuse, then you'll hang for treason just like you should have 24 years ago. But this time, your little helper will hang right beside you, and every Apache you've ever treated will die screaming before we're done." After Wild left, Agnes sat in the gathering darkness and contemplated the trap that had finally closed around her. She could stop treating Apache patients, could turn away the next wounded child or fevered grandmother, could save herself and Miriam by letting others die. It would be the sensible choice, the rational choice, the choice that preserved her secret and her life. But as she looked at the medical instruments gleaming in the lamplight, instruments that had saved so many lives, white and red and brown and black, Agnes knew she could not make that choice again. 24 years ago, she had chosen her brother's life over the lives of strangers. The guilt of that decision had driven her across half a continent, had shaped every choice she had made since. She would not repeat that sin, no matter what it cost her. The next morning brought 3 more Apache patients, a young woman with a difficult pregnancy, an old man with a broken leg, and a warrior with infected bullet wounds. Agnes treated them all, knowing that each bandage applied, each dose of medicine administered, each life saved was another nail in her coffin. But she also knew, with the clarity that comes from finally stopping running, that some prices were worth paying and some stands were worth taking, even when, especially when the cost was everything she had left to lose. Naiche received word of the nuns' arrest as the sun was setting over the Dragoon Mountains, painting the desert in shades of gold and crimson. The war chief stood motionless on a rocky outcrop, his weathered face betraying nothing of the rage burning in his chest. Below him, the Apache camp bustled with the quiet efficiency of a people who had learned to live with constant danger. Swift Eagle saw the iron cage being built in the town square, reported Broken Arrow, his scarred face grim in the fading light. The white eyes gather like vultures screaming for blood. Even the children cry for death. And the priest? Naiche asked, his voice carefully neutral. Crane preaches holy war. Says the women betrayed God by healing Apache children. Says they must die to cleanse the land of evil. Broken Arrow spat into the dust. The man's madness spreads like plague. Half the territory will ride to Dust Haven to watch the hanging. Naiche nodded slowly, understanding the trap that had been laid with such careful precision. Crane knew the Apache code of honor, knew that Naiche could not let the nuns die without fighting to save them. But he also knew that any Apache attack on Dust Haven would provide the perfect excuse for the territorial governor to send cavalry to finish what the civilian authorities had started. How many warriors are ready to fight? The war chief asked. 12 good men, Broken Arrow replied. But the town has 30 guns, maybe more. And if we attack openly, we give Crane his war. Naiche finished. The bluecoats will come with howitzers and Gatling guns, and our people will be hunted like animals until none remain. Swift Eagle stepped forward, his young face burning with frustrated rage. Then we let the white women die after they risked everything to heal our children. His voice cracked with emotion. My sister's son lives because of their medicine. Moon that rises draws breath because they fought death itself to save her. Are we to abandon honor because it has become inconvenient? Broken Arrow's scarred face darkened. Honor is a luxury, boy. The dead have no honor, only empty graves. These women knew the price of their choices. Let them pay it. No. Naiche's voice carried absolute finality. The women showed mercy to our children when they could have turned them away. They chose healing over safety, Apache lives over white approval. We cannot abandon such courage, especially if the cost is high. The war chief outlined his plan with the careful precision of a man who had spent his life fighting impossible odds. A small group would infiltrate Dust Haven under cover of darkness, free the nuns, and disappear into the desert before the alarm could be raised. No unnecessary killing, no burning, no scalping. Just a surgical strike to extract 2 women who had risked everything to heal Apache children. But even as Naiche spoke the words, he felt the weight of futility pressing down on him. Crane was no fool. He would have anticipated exactly this response, would have prepared countermeasures. The rescue mission felt less like a plan than a march towards certain death. It was a good plan, nonetheless, carefully considered and precisely executed. It might even have worked if not for the boy who had been listening from the shadows, trading information to survive in a world that cared nothing for Mexican orphans. Miguel Santos was 13 years old, small for his age, but quick and clever. His parents had died of cholera 2 years earlier, leaving him and his younger brother Carlos to fend for themselves on the harsh frontier. Miguel had learned that information was currency in Dust Haven, and he had become very good at gathering it. The boy had been following Apache sign for 3 days, hoping to learn something worth selling to the cavalry or the territorial authorities. When he heard Naiche's plan, Miguel's dark eyes gleamed with opportunity. This intelligence was worth real money, the kind that could buy passage to California and a new life away from the endless violence of the frontier. But Miguel had made a crucial error in his calculations. Tom Wilde was not a man who shared wealth or tolerated loose ends. When the boy arrived at the rancher's house with his information, Wilde listened with growing excitement, then paid him with a bullet to the head. Dead boys tell no tales. Wilde muttered, dragging Miguel's body into the desert where the coyotes would dispose of the evidence. And this tale is too valuable to risk on a greaser's loose tongue. But Miguel's younger brother Carlos had followed him, had seen the whole transaction from the shadows behind Wild's stable. The 10-year-old boy waited until Wild was gone, then crept forward to kneel beside his brother's still form. Carlos had no words for his grief, no way to comprehend the casual cruelty that had ended Miguel's young life. But he understood one thing with perfect clarity. The Apache were walking into a trap, and he was the only one who could warn them. Carlos had grown up on the stories his grandmother told about the old days when Apache and Mexican lived as neighbors, when the desert was not divided by the arbitrary lines of race and nation. He knew enough Apache words to make himself understood, and more importantly, he knew the secret paths through the desert that would let him reach Naiche's camp unseen. The boy arrived at the Apache stronghold as the war party was preparing to depart, his small form materializing from the darkness like a ghost. Naiche's warriors reached for their weapons, but the war chief raised a hand for calm. "I speak for my dead brother," Carlos said in broken Apache, tears streaming down his dirt-stained face. "The White Eyes know you come. They wait with many guns. The priest man he makes trap for Apache blood." Naiche knelt before the boy, studying his face in the firelight. Carlos's grief was genuine, and so was his warning. The war chief felt a familiar cold anger settle in his stomach, the same fury that had sustained him through a dozen battles against cavalry and Texas Rangers. "How do you know this little brother?" he asked gently. "My brother Miguel, he sold words to the big rancher. The rancher paid him with bullets instead of gold. I saw it all. Miguel falling, the rancher laughing, the body dragged away like garbage." Carlos wiped his nose on his sleeve, his child's voice breaking. "I came to warn because Miguel would want me to. Because the white women, they are good. They heal all people, not just white people." Broken Arrow spat into the fire, his scarred face twisted with rage. "It's a trap, brother. We ride into Dust Haven tonight, we die. All of us. The boy speaks truth, I can see it in his eyes. Then we don't ride into Dust Haven." Naiche replied, his mind already working through new possibilities. "We find another way." Carlos wiped his eyes and straightened his small shoulders. "I know another way. Secret way. My brother and me, we used to explore the old mine workings behind the town. There's a tunnel that goes under the jail, connects to the basement. The White Eyes, they don't know about it." Swift Eagle stepped forward, his young face eager. "Let me go with you, Uncle. This is work for young men who can crawl through tight spaces." But Naiche shook his head. "If this goes wrong, one man trapped is better than many. And someone needs to carry word back to our people if I don't return." The war chief studied Carlos's tear-streaked face, weighing trust against desperation. The boy had no reason to lie. His brother was dead, his future uncertain, his only concern the safety of two women who had shown kindness to the despised and forgotten. "Show me," Naiche said simply. The abandoned mine was exactly where Carlos had promised, a black hole in the hillside behind Dust Haven, hidden by scrub oak and half-collapsed timber supports. The boy led them to the entrance with the sure-footed confidence of someone who had played these tunnels since childhood. Goes down steep, then turns toward town. Carlos explained, his voice echoing strangely in the narrow space. "Big cave-in maybe halfway through, but there's a crawlway if you're not too fat. Comes up in the stone basement under the jail." Naiche studied the tunnel mouth, calculating risks and opportunities. The shaft was narrow, barely wide enough for a man to crawl through on his belly. If they were discovered inside, they would be trapped like rats in a sewer. But it offered the element of surprise, and surprise was often the difference between victory and death. "I go alone," Naiche decided. "If something goes wrong, one man trapped is better than many." "Brother Ikurov." Broken Arrow protested, his scarred hand gripping the war chief's shoulder. "Let me come with you. The women will need help getting out, and if there's fighting, it means we've already failed." Naiche's voice was calm, but his dark eyes burned with determination. "This is not a raid, old friend. This is rescue. Silent and swift, like the hunting cat. Swift Eagle stepped forward, his young face tight with frustration. And if you don't return, if they capture you, kill you. What becomes of our people then? Naiche studied the boy's face, seeing his own doubts reflected there. If I don't return by dawn, take Carlos to safety and tell our people what happened here. Tell them we died, trying to honor our debts to those who showed us mercy. The war chief checked his weapons one final time, rifle, pistol knife, and war club, then squeezed into the mine shaft. The tunnel was even tighter than it had appeared from outside, forcing him to crawl on his belly through darkness thick as black velvet. The air was stale and choking, filled with the dust of broken dreams and abandoned hopes. The cave-in Carlos had mentioned was worse than described, a mass of fallen rock and rotted timber that blocked 90% of the tunnel. Naiche had to remove his weapons and push them ahead of him, then squeeze through a gap barely wider than his shoulders. For several heart-stopping moments, he was stuck, unable to move forward or back, his lungs burning from the dusty air, while his mind conjured images of dying slowly in this buried tomb. Then the rocks shifted slightly, and he was through, emerging into a wider section of tunnel that seemed to lead downward toward the town. The air was fresher here, carrying the smells of wood smoke and unwashed humanity that marked civilization. Behind him, the tunnel stretched back into impenetrable darkness. Ahead, a faint glimmer of light suggested an opening. Naiche crawled forward with infinite patience, moving inches at a time to avoid dislodging loose stones. His shoulders ached, his knees were raw with scrapes, and his throat burned from the dusty air. But he pressed on, driven by the memory of Agnes's gentle hands, treating his nephew's fever, of Miriam's quiet strength as she held Apache children while their mothers wept with gratitude. The basement was exactly as Carlos had described, a stone-walled cellar beneath the jail, filled with moldering supplies and broken furniture. But as Naiche pulled himself from the tunnel opening and crouched in the shadows, he realized that something was wrong. The basement was too quiet, the silence too complete. No sound of guards above, no creak of floorboards, no murmur of voices. It felt like a trap. Naiche drew his knife and moved toward the stone steps with predatory caution. Each footfall was tested before his weight committed, each shadow examined for signs of ambush. The silence pressed against him like a living thing, and he could feel his warrior's instincts screaming warnings. The basement door was not locked, another sign that something was amiss. Naiche eased it open inch by inch, peering through the crack into the main room of the jail. What he saw there made his blood sing with the promise of violence. 4 guards sat around a table playing cards, but their posture was wrong, too tense, too alert for men engaged in casual gambling. Their rifles were within easy reach, and their eyes kept flicking toward the basement door. They were waiting for something or someone. Beyond the guards, the iron cage sat in the center of the room, its occupants huddled together in apparent sleep. But even from his position in the doorway, Naiche could see that Agnes's breathing was too controlled, too measured for genuine slumber. She was awake and alert, probably had been for hours, or it was definitely a trap, but Naiche was committed now. The women were here vulnerable and depending on him. Whether he lived or died in the attempt, he could not abandon them to Crane's twisted justice. The war chief moved like flowing shadow, crossing the room in 4 silent strides. His knife found the first guard's throat before the man could even look up from his cards. His war club crushed the second guard's skull while the fool was still reaching for his rifle. The third guard managed to open his mouth to scream before a Naiche's tomahawk split his head like a melon. The fourth guard, younger than the others and quicker on the draw, proved more challenging. He rolled away from the table as his companions died, bringing his rifle up in a smooth motion, born of desperation and training. The shot rang out like thunder in the confined space, the bullet scoring a line of fire across Naiche's ribs. "Apache!" The guard screamed, his voice cracking with terror as he worked the bolt action. "Apache in the jail, Tom. He's here. The trap worked." Naiche came up from behind the overturned table like a wolf attacking prey, his knife leading the way. The guard tried to bring his rifle around, but the war chief was already inside his reach, steel sliding between ribs to find the heart. The man died with Apache steel in his chest and Apache breath on his face, his final vision. The painted features of a warrior whose people he had helped to slaughter. Agnes woke, or rather stopped pretending to sleep, as Naiche approached the cage with the guard's keys. Her gray eyes were alert and calculating, taking in the blood on his weapons, the wound in his side, the tension in his movements. "You came," she said simply, her voice carrying no surprise, only a quiet gratitude. "Did you doubt it?" Naiche replied, working the lock with fingers made clumsy by urgency. "Those who heal Apache children will always find Apache protection." He freed the cage door and stepped back as Agnes shook Miriam awake. The younger nun gasped when she saw the dead guards crossing herself reflexively, but she didn't waste time on useless protest. Whatever innocence she had possessed when she arrived in Dust Haven had been burned away by 3 months of frontier reality. "There's a tunnel in the basement," Naiche explained quickly. "It leads to the desert where my warriors wait. But we must go now. The gunshot will bring others." Already voices could be heard from the street outside, boots pounding on wooden sidewalks, shouts of alarm, and the rattle of weapons being readied. The trap was closing, but it hadn't quite snapped shut yet. They made it to the basement stairs before disaster struck with the sudden violence of a desert storm. The jail's front door exploded inward under the force of a rifle butt, and Tom Wilde charged through with a dozen armed men behind him. The rancher's face was twisted with fury and anticipation, his rifle already trained on the fleeing prisoners. "Well, well." Wilde drawled, his voice dripping with satisfaction. "Look what we caught in our little snare. Tom Wilde, Apache killer, and proud of it." Behind Wilde came 2 more men. Naiche didn't recognize hard-faced gunmen with the look of professionals about them. But it was the figure who entered last that made Agnes's blood turn to ice in her veins. Reverend Silas Crane stepped through the doorway, like an angel of death, his black coat billowing dramatically in the night wind. His pale eyes blazed with fanatic triumph, and the smile on his thin lips was the expression of a man who had been proven right about everything. Chief Naiche. Crane said, his voice carrying the mock courtesy of a cat playing with wounded prey. "How good of you to accept our invitation. I trust you found the accommodations educational." Naiche's hand tightened on his war club, but he didn't raise it. 3 rifles were aimed at his chest, and Agnes and Miriam were directly in the line of fire. One wrong move, and they would all die in a hail of bullets. "Let the women go," he said quietly. "Your quarrel is with me." Wilde laughed, the sound ugly and triumphant. "Oh, but that's where you're wrong, Chief. See, our quarrel is with anyone who betrays the white race. And these 2 ladies have been very naughty indeed." The rancher stepped closer, his rifle never wavering. "Tell him, Sister Agnes. Or should I say, Margaret Whitmore. Tell the chief about your little secret about the real reason you've been so eager to help his people." Agnes felt the weight of 24 years crashing down on her shoulders. The moment of truth had finally arrived, and there was no more running, no more hiding behind false names and holy vows. "My name is Margaret Whitmore," she said, her voice steady despite the fear clawing at her throat. "During the war, I sold medical supplies to Confederate agents in exchange for my brother's life. Union soldiers died because medicine never reached them. I've spent 24 years trying to atone for that sin." The silence that followed was broken only by the sound of distant gunfire as Apache warriors battled townsmen in Dust Haven streets. Then Miriam spoke, her young voice cutting through the tension like a blade. "So what?" she demanded, stepping forward to stand beside Agnes. "So, what if she made a mistake 24 years ago? Look at what she's done since then, and the lives she's saved, the wounds she's healed, the bridges she's built between peoples who had every reason to hate each other. Crane's smile widened, revealing teeth like yellowed tombstones. Bridges, you say, between the children of light and the children of darkness, my dear child. You are as deluded as your mentor. There can be no peace between Christian and savage, no compromise between civilization and barbarism. The Reverend's voice rose with fanatic fervor. This woman, this Margaret Whitmore, has revealed her true nature at last. Once a traitor, always a traitor. She betrayed her own people during the war, and now she betrays them again by consorting with Apache devils. Enough talk! Wilde snarled, his finger tightening on the trigger. Let's finish this and be done with it. The town's waiting for a show, and I aim to give them one they'll never forget. But before he could fire, new sounds reached their ears from the street above. Apache war cries echoing through the night, the thunder of hoofbeats on hard-packed earth, and the distinctive whistle of arrows cutting through air. Broken Arrow comes, Naiche said with grim satisfaction. My brother could not wait for dawn after all. The Apache rescue party hit Dust Haven like a force of nature. But they were too few and too late to prevent the trap that was already closing around their war chief. In the basement, Agnes made a decision that would define the rest of her life. As Wilde's finger tightened on the trigger, she lunged forward, placing herself between the rifle and Naiche. Wait, she cried. There's something else you need to know. Sister, no. Miriam gasped, but Agnes was already committed. I didn't just sell morphine to the Confederates, she said, her voice carrying clearly in the sudden silence. I sold information too. Troop movement, supply schedules, battle plans. I wasn't just a traitor, I was a spy. It was a lie, but it was the kind of lie that might save lives. If she could convince Wilde and Crane that she was a more valuable prisoner than a dead martyr, if she could buy time for the Apache rescue to reach them, Wilde's eyes lit up with avarice. A spy? What kind of information? The kind that could hang every Confederate officer I ever dealt with. Agnes replied, thinking fast. Names, dates, payment schedules, dead drops, all hidden in a safe place, all written in code that only I can read. It was complete fiction, but Wilde was already calculating the possibilities. Such information could be sold to the government for a fortune, or used to blackmail former Confederates who had prospered after the war. Where? The rancher demanded. It's in a place only I know, Agnes said steadily. Without me, you'll never reach it. But if I stay alive, maybe we can figure something out. Crane's face darkened with fury. This changes nothing. The woman is still a traitor, still a consort of savages. She must die. Maybe, Wilde said slowly, but not tonight. Information like that could be worth more than all the cattle in Arizona territory. We keep her alive until we get what we want. The standoff stretched taut as a bowstring each side, waiting for the other to make the first move. Then from the tunnel entrance came a small voice that changed everything. Senor Wilde. Carlos Santos stepped out of the shadows, his child's face streaked with tears and dirt. I have something to tell you about the Apache. Wilde spun around, his face contorting with rage. You little greaser, I thought you were dead. Miguel is dead. Carlos said, his voice steady despite his fear. You killed him for bringing you information. But I have better information, senor. I know where the Apache keep their gold and their stolen horses, their secret camps. I can lead you to treasure that will make you rich beyond dreaming. It was another lie. But Carlos had learned from watching his brother that desperate men would believe almost anything if it promised them wealth. And the 10-year-old boy had a plan. A dangerous, desperate plan that might just save them all. What kind of treasure? Wilde demanded, his greed overcoming his caution. Apache gold. Carlos set his eyes wide with apparent innocence. Hidden in caves in the mountains. Enough to buy your own ranch, your own town, your own army. But we must go now before the other Apache find it and move it to a new hiding place. Agnes understood immediately what the boy was doing, and her heart swelled with admiration for his courage. Carlos was trying to draw Wild and his men away from the jail to give Naiche and the Apache warriors a chance to escape or counterattack. But Crane was not so easily fooled. "This is a trick," he snarled. "The boy lies to save his Apache friends. We should kill them all and be done with it." "Maybe," Wild said, but Agnes could see the greed burning in his eyes. "Or maybe the boy speaks truth. Gold is gold, whether it comes from Apache caves or Confederate spies." The rancher was wavering, torn between his desire for immediate revenge and his lust for wealth. Agnes decided to tip the scales. "The boy is right about one thing," she said quietly. "There is treasure in the mountains. Not Apache gold, but something more valuable. The location of a Confederate treasure train that was lost during the war. Bullion worth more than $1 million hidden in a cave system that only I know how to find." It was the biggest lie of all, but Wild swallowed it like a starving man devouring bread. His eyes went wide with avarice, and Agnes could practically see him calculating the possibilities. $1 million, he breathed. Maybe more. Gold, silver, Confederate currency that could be sold to collectors. Enough to buy your own piece of the territory to set yourself up as a king. Agnes paused, letting the words sink in. But it would require a journey into the mountains and guides who know the Apache trails. It would require keeping me alive and cooperative. The temptation was too much for Wild's greedy soul to resist. He lowered his rifle slightly, his mind already racing ahead to visions of unimaginable wealth. "Where?" he demanded. "Where is this treasure?" "In the Dragoon Mountains," Agnes replied. "But reaching it will require crossing Apache territory, and they don't take kindly to trespassers. You'll need their cooperation, or at least their neutrality." Crane's face twisted with rage. "This is blasphemy. We cannot bargain with the devil. The woman must die, and the Apache with her." But Wild was already lost in dreams of avarice. "Shut up, preacher. $1 million changes everything. We can hire an army with that kind of money, buy our own territory, write our own laws." The rancher turned to his men. "Jake, Sam, secure the prisoners. We're taking them with us to the mountains. And send word to the boys outside, I want 20 men ready to ride at first light." Agnes felt a mixture of relief and terror. Her lies had bought them time, but she had also committed them to a journey that would almost certainly end in disaster. Still, a slim chance of survival was better than certain death in a Dust Haven jail. As Wild's men moved to bind their hands, Agnes caught Carlos's eye and nodded slightly. The boy had shown remarkable courage and quick thinking, but the hardest part was yet to come. They would need all their wits and more than a little luck to survive what was coming. But for now, they were alive, and that was enough. The desert had taught Agnes many things during her years of exile, and one of the most important was that as long as breath remained in her body, hope remained in her heart. The night was far from over, and the game was far from played out. In the darkness beyond Dust Haven's flickering lights, Apache warriors waited with weapons ready and hearts full of righteous fury. The battle for the souls of 2 women who had chosen healing over hatred was about to begin in earnest. The ride into the Dragoon Mountains began at dawn, a column of 20 armed men escorting their prisoners toward what they believed would be unimaginable wealth. Tom Wild rode at the front, his eyes bright with avarice, while Reverend Crane followed behind with the sullen anger of a man whose holy war had been postponed by another man's greed. Agnes and Miriam rode with their hands bound, flanked by guards who watched them with the casual indifference of men handling livestock. Behind them, Naiche sat his horse, with the stoic dignity of a captured war chief, his dark eyes scanning the landscape for opportunities that might not come. Carlos rode beside Agnes, his small form dwarfed by the saddle of a horse too large for him. The boy had insisted on coming, claiming he knew the mountain trails better than any white man. In truth, he was the only one among them who knew exactly where they were going, not to any treasure cave, but to the heart of Apache territory, where Naiche's warriors waited. How much further? Wild called back, his voice tight with impatience. By noon. Carlos replied, his childish voice carrying no hint of deception. The cave is in a canyon that can only be reached when the sun is high. Otherwise, the shadows hide the entrance. It was a lie, but it was the kind of lie that would keep them alive for a few more hours. Carlos had spent the night thinking, planning, trying to figure out how to turn their desperate situation to their advantage. The boy was young, but he had learned hard lessons on the frontier about the price of survival. As they rode deeper into the mountains, Agnes found herself remembering another journey, another time when she had been forced to choose between competing loyalties. The memory was as sharp as a knife blade, despite the years that had passed. Chicago, 1862. The Confederate agent had been a soft-spoken man with gentle eyes and a southern accent that reminded her of home. He had approached her after a 12-hour shift in the field hospital when she was too exhausted to think clearly. "Miss Whitmore," he had said, his voice sympathetic. "I understand your brother is being held at Andersonville. A terrible place from what I hear. Men dying daily from disease and neglect." Agnes had known it was true. Thomas's last letter had been barely legible, written in a hand that shook with fever and weakness. He was dying by inches in that hellish prison, and there was nothing she could do to help him. "I can arrange his release," the agent had continued. "A simple prisoner exchange, no questions asked. All I need in return is a small favor: medical supplies for our own wounded, morphine mainly, bandages, simple human charity." Agnes had known it was wrong, had understood that Union soldiers would die for want of the medicine she was being asked to provide. But Thomas was her only family, the only person in the world who truly mattered to her. How could she let him die to save strangers? The choice had seemed so clear at the time, so justified by love and loyalty. It was only later, when she learned that Thomas had already died 2 days before his supposed release, that she understood the true price of her betrayal. The Confederate agent had lied to her, had used her love for her brother to make her complicit in the deaths of men she had sworn to heal. That knowledge had driven her west, had shaped every choice she had made since. She had spent 24 years trying to atone for that one moment of weakness, that one choice to put personal loyalty above professional duty. "Sister Agnes," Miriam whispered, breaking her reverie. "What are we going to do when we reach this cave that doesn't exist?" Agnes looked at the young nun, seeing the fear and confusion in her eyes. Miriam deserved better than this, deserved to live out her days in peaceful service to God and humanity. But the frontier had a way of making philosophers out of everyone, whether they wanted wisdom or not. "We're going to trust in Providence," Agnes replied quietly, "and in the courage of a 10-year-old boy who has already shown more wisdom than most adults." The column rode on through the morning, climbing steadily into the high country where the air grew thin and the silence deep. The mountains were beautiful in their harsh way, but Agnes could feel the weight of hidden eyes watching from every ridge and shadow. Naiche's people were out there, tracking their movements, waiting for the right moment to strike. As the sun approached its zenith, Carlos began to guide them toward a narrow canyon that cut deep into the mountainside. The walls rose sheer on either side, creating a natural corridor that would make an excellent killing ground for defenders. "This is it," the boy announced, his voice bright with false excitement. "The treasure cave is just ahead, around the next bend." Wild spurred his horse forward, his eyes scanning the canyon walls with the intensity of a man who could already taste his fortune. But Agnes noticed that several of his men were looking nervous, their hands creeping toward their weapons as they realized how exposed they were in the narrow passage. "I don't like this," muttered one of the guards. Feels like a trap. Everything feels like a trap to you, Pete. Wild snapped. Keep your nerve and your mouth shut. We're about to be richer than we ever dreamed. But even as he spoke, the words, Wild's own instincts were beginning to sound warnings. The canyon was too quiet, too empty. And there was something about the way the boy kept glancing at the rim rocks above that made the rancher's skin crawl. They rounded the bend and found themselves in a circular amphitheater carved from living rock by centuries of wind and water. The walls rose almost vertically on all sides, broken only by narrow ledges and crevices that could hide a dozen men. At the far end of the amphitheater, a dark opening in the rock face suggested the presence of a cave system. There, Carlos said, pointing toward the opening. The treasure is in there, hidden in chambers that go deep into the mountain. Wild dismounted and approached the cave mouth with the cautious excitement of a man who had dreamed of this moment for years. His men followed, their weapons ready, but their attention focused on the promise of wealth rather than the possibility of danger. That was their mistake. The Apache attack came without warning, arrows whistling down from the canyon rim like deadly rain. 3 of Wild's men died in the first volley, their bodies crumpling to the rocky ground, with feathered shafts protruding from their chests. The survivors scrambled for cover, but there was precious little to be found in the exposed amphitheater. Ambush! Wild screamed, diving behind a boulder as more arrows rained down. It's a trap! The boy led us into a trap! Naiche rolled from his horse and landed in a crouch, his bound hands not preventing him from moving with the fluid grace of a born warrior. One of the guards raised his rifle to shoot the war chief, but an Apache arrow took him in the throat before he could fire. Agnes grabbed Miriam and pulled her toward the cave mouth, seeking whatever shelter they could find. Carlos was already moving his small form, darting between the rocks with the agility of a mountain goat. The boy had played his part perfectly, leading their captors into the killing ground where his Apache allies waited. But the battle was far from over. Wild and his surviving men had found defensive positions among the rocks, and their rifles gave them a significant advantage over the Apache boos. The canyon filled with the roar of gunfire and the echoes of war cries, a symphony of violence that had been building for days. Sister Agnes, Miriam cried out, her voice barely audible above the chaos. We have to do something. Agnes looked around desperately, her mind racing. The cave mouth was only a few yards away, but reaching it would require crossing open ground swept by gunfire. If they could make it to the tunnel system, they might be able to escape in the confusion. But first, she had to free Naiche. The war chief was pinned down behind a small boulder, his bound hands making it impossible for him to defend himself effectively. He needed her help, and she needed his warrior skills if any of them were going to survive this battle. Agnes pulled her small surgical knife from her medical bag, the one item Wild had allowed her to keep, and began crawling toward Naiche's position. Bullets whined overhead, chipping stone and raising clouds of dust, but she pressed on with the determination of a woman who had finally found her true calling. She reached the war chief, just as one of Wild's men raised his rifle to finish him off. Without thinking, Agnes lunged forward, driving her surgical blade into the gunman's back. The man screamed and collapsed, his rifle clattering across the rocks. I always wondered if I had the stomach for killing, Agnes said grimly, cutting the ropes that bound Naiche's hands. Now I know. The war chief flexed his freed hands, then picked up the dead man's rifle. You have the heart of a warrior, sister. But this battle is far from over. As if to prove his point, Tom Wild's voice echoed across the amphitheater, twisted with rage and pain. Kill them all. Every last one of them. I want their scalps hanging from my saddle. The rancher had taken an arrow in his shoulder, but he was still fighting, still coordinating his men's defense. And despite their losses, Wild's party still had superior firepower and defensive positions. The Apache were brave, but they were also taking casualties they could not afford. Agnes looked around at the chaos, at the bodies of men on both sides, at the young nun who had followed her into this hell out of simple faith and loyalty. The weight of all her choices, past and present, seemed to press down on her like a physical burden. There has to be another way, she said more to herself than to Naiche. There has to be a way to end this without everyone dying. The war chief gave her a look that might have been pity. Sometimes, sister, there is no way to avoid the cost of our choices. Sometimes the only thing we can do is make certain that cost is paid by the right people. But Agnes was already moving, her mind made up. She stood and walked out into the center of the amphitheater, her hands raised in a gesture of surrender. Gunfire gradually slackened as both sides realized what she was doing. Enough, she called out, her voice carrying clearly in the sudden quiet. I have something to say that will change everything. Wild emerged from behind his boulder, his rifle trained on her chest. You betrayed us, you lying witch. Led us into this trap. Yes, Agnes said simply. I lied to you. There is no treasure, no Confederate gold, no $1 million waiting in that cave. I made it all up to save our lives. The admission sent a ripple of shock through Wild's surviving men. They had followed him into the mountains based on her promise of wealth, and now they were learning it had all been a lie. But I have something better to offer, Agnes continued. I have the truth. The whole truth about who I am and what I've done. And I think you'll find it's worth more than any treasure. She looked around at the assembled men, white and Apache, young and old, all united in their capacity for violence, but divided by everything else. My name is Margaret Whitmore, and I am wanted by the federal government for treason committed during the war between the states. I sold medical supplies to Confederate agents, and Union soldiers died because of what I did. The words hung in the air, like smoke from a funeral pyre. Agnes felt the weight of 24 years of guilt and secrecy lifting from her shoulders, replaced by something cleaner, but no less heavy, the burden of truth finally spoken. I've spent more than 2 decades running from that crime, trying to atone through service to others. But I've learned something important in my years of exile. Redemption cannot be earned through good works. It can only be found through the courage to face our failures and accept the consequences of our choices. She spread her arms wide, a gesture that encompassed the entire amphitheater. I surrender myself to military justice. I'll stand trial for my crimes, accept whatever punishment the court deems fit. But I ask for mercy for the others. They are not criminals, only people caught up in the web of my past mistakes. The silence that followed was broken by the sound of boots on stone. Colonel Harrison appeared at the canyon rim, surrounded by cavalry troopers whose rifles were trained on the combatants below. The young officer's face was grim as he took in the scene of carnage. This is Colonel Harrison, 5th United States Cavalry. His voice boomed across the amphitheater. All parties will lay down their weapons immediately and surrender to military authority. Agnes felt a surge of hope. Harrison was a fair man, a professional soldier who understood the difference between justice and revenge. If anyone could sort out this mess, it was him. But Tom Wild was not ready to surrender his dreams of wealth and revenge. You got no authority here, Colonel. This is civilian business. Not anymore, Harrison replied calmly. The territorial governor has declared martial law in response to reports of Apache raids and civilian vigilantism. All parties will surrender their weapons and submit to military justice. The standoff stretched taut as a bowstring, each side weighing their options. Then Naiche stepped forward, his rifle held high above his head. I am Naiche of the Chiricahua Apache, he called out. I surrender myself to military authority, but I ask for protection for the women who showed mercy to Apache children. One by one, the other Apache warriors followed their chief's example, emerging from their hiding places with weapons raised in surrender. It was a moment of profound dignity, men choosing honor over continued violence. Wild and his surviving men had no choice but to follow suit. The rancher threw down his rifle with a curse, his dreams of wealth and revenge turning to ash in his mouth. As the cavalry moved in to secure the prisoners, Agnes felt a hand on her shoulder. She turned to find Miriam beside her, the young nun's face streaked with tears, but her eyes bright with something that might have been pride. "You did it," Miriam whispered. "You found a way to stop the killing." Agnes nodded, but her expression remained grave. "I stopped this killing. But there will be trials, judgments, consequences. The hardest part is yet to come. But for the first time in 24 years, Margaret Whitmore was ready to face those consequences. She had finally found the courage to stop running from her past and start building a future based on truth rather than lies. The desert wind whispered through the canyon, carrying with it the promise of justice tempered by mercy of redemption, earned through courage rather than bought with good works. And in that wind, Agnes heard the voice of a woman who had finally learned the difference between penance and peace. The court-martial convened at Fort Huachuca 3 weeks later, drawing attention from newspapers across the Southwest and beyond. The case of Margaret Whitmore had captured the public imagination, a battlefield nurse turned frontier healer, a woman who had spent a quarter-century trying to atone for wartime treason through service to the very people her society considered enemies. Colonel Harrison presided over the proceedings with the careful neutrality of a professional soldier who understood that military justice was often the only real justice available on the frontier. The charges were complex and interconnected. Whitmore faced prosecution for wartime treason and conspiracy with hostile Indians, while Naiche was accused of murder, kidnapping, and armed resistance to civil authority. The courtroom was packed with spectators, Apache leaders, territorial officials, newspaper reporters, and curious citizens who had traveled from across the territory to witness what many considered the trial of the century. In the front row sat Sister Miriam. Her hands folded in prayer, her face calm despite the gravity of the proceedings. Agnes testified first, her voice steady, as she recounted her wartime service and the impossible choice that had led to her crimes. She spoke of her brother Thomas dying in that Confederate prison and the agent who had offered medical supplies in exchange for Union morphine. She described the 24 years of running that had followed the constant fear of discovery, the desperate attempt to atone through service to others. "I knew men would die because of what I did," she told the packed courtroom, tears streaming down her weathered face. "I knew I was betraying my oath as a healer and my duty as an American. But Thomas was the only family I had left, and I couldn't let him die in that hellish place." The prosecution painted her as a traitor, who had never truly repented, who had continued her pattern of betrayal by aiding Apache enemies of civilization. They brought witnesses who testified to her treatment of Apache patients, her alleged sharing of military intelligence, her participation in what they characterized as a conspiracy against the territorial government. But the defense presented a different picture. 24 years of selfless service, hundreds of lives saved without regard for race or politics, a woman who had risked execution rather than abandon those who had shown her mercy. They called witnesses who testified to Agnes's skill as a healer. Her courage in treating patients others had abandoned her role in preventing bloodshed between Apache and white communities. Sister Miriam's testimony proved particularly compelling. The young nun described Agnes's treatment of Apache children, her willingness to face death rather than betray those who had protected her. Sister Agnes Margaret could have remained silent about her past. Miriam told the court, her voice carrying clearly in the hushed courtroom. She could have let innocent people die to preserve her secret. Instead, she chose truth over safety, chose other people's lives over her own comfort. If that is not redemption, then I don't know what redemption means. But the most dramatic testimony came from an unexpected source. On the trial's third day, a weathered man in civilian clothes entered the courtroom and asked permission to address the court. He identified himself as Thomas Whitmore, Margaret's brother, the same brother whose life she had tried to save 24 years earlier. "I've been searching for my sister for over 2 decades. Thomas told the hushed courtroom, his voice thick with emotion. I knew she had sacrificed everything to save my worthless hide. I wanted to tell her it wasn't worth it, that she should have let me die rather than compromise her principles. He paused, looking directly at Margaret with eyes bright with tears. But I was wrong. Dead wrong. What I thought was a betrayal was actually the beginning of something greater. My sister's choice to save me, misguided as it was, led her to a life of service that has saved hundreds of lives. She turned her greatest failure into her greatest triumph. Thomas stepped closer to the defendant's table. Margaret, I release you from any debt you think you owe me. You paid it in full with 24 years of healing and mercy. You paid it when you chose to face your past rather than let innocent people die for your sins. The courtroom was silent for a long moment after Thomas finished speaking. Even the prosecutor seemed moved by the reunion of siblings separated by decades of guilt and shame. When Naiche took the stand, he spoke with the quiet dignity of a man who had already made his peace with death. He described the Apache code of honor that had demanded he rescue the women who had saved Apache children. He spoke of Agnes's courage in the jail, her willingness to step between armed enemies to prevent bloodshed. The white woman showed mercy to my people when she could have turned us away. Naiche said his English careful but clear. She risked her life to heal Apache children, then risked it again to protect Apache warriors from a trap. If such actions make her a traitor to your people, then your people have forgotten what honor means. Colonel Harrison's questions were pointed but fair. Chief Naiche, do you deny that you killed 4 men in that jail? I do not deny it. They were preparing to murder 2 women, whose only crime was showing kindness to children. I did what any warrior must do. I protected the innocent from those who would harm them. And if this court finds you guilty of murder, Naiche straightened in his chair, his dark eyes meeting the colonel's gaze without flinching. Then I will face whatever punishment you decree. But I will not apologize for defending those who defended my people. Perhaps the most shocking testimony came from Carlos Santos, the young boy who had helped orchestrate the rescue attempt. Carlos had been found by cavalry scouts after the battle and had been brought to the fort as a witness. The 11-year-old boy stood in the witness chair, dwarfed by the formal military proceedings, but unafraid as he told his story. He described watching his brother Miguel sell information to Tom Wilde, then seeing Wilde murder the boy to keep him quiet. My brother, he only wanted money to get us away from the violence. Carlos said, his English broken but understandable. The big rancher, he killed Miguel just for talking. That's when I knew the white women were in trouble, so I went to warn the Apache. The revelation sent shockwaves through the courtroom. Wilde, who had been sitting in the gallery as a key witness for the prosecution, went pale as a sheet. Within hours, he was under arrest himself, charged with murder and conspiracy. But perhaps the most damaging testimony came from Reverend Crane himself. The fanatical minister took the stand with the confidence of a man convinced of his own righteousness. But Colonel Harrison's cross-examination systematically dismantled his carefully constructed narrative. Reverend Crane. The colonel said, consulting his notes, "You testified that Sister Whitmore and Chief Naiche were part of a conspiracy against the territorial government. Can you provide specific evidence of this conspiracy?" Crane's pale eyes blazed with fanatic fire. "The evidence is obvious to anyone with eyes to see. The woman treated Apache savages, giving them information about our defenses, our patrol routes. Do you have any actual evidence of intelligence sharing? Any documents, witnesses, specific instances where classified information was passed? The very act of treating the enemy is treason enough." "I see. And your assertion that the Apache were planning a general uprising, do you have evidence of that as well?" The examination continued relentlessly, revealing the gaps and contradictions in Crane's story. Under pressure, the Reverend's carefully maintained facade began to crumble, revealing the fanatic beneath. "The Red Devil must be exterminated." Crane finally exploded, his voice cracking with hysteria. God has given us dominion over this land, but we must be willing to cleanse it with holy fire. The Apache are beasts, animals, obstacles to be removed from the path of Christian civilization. The outburst stunned the courtroom into silence. Even Crane's supporters seemed taken aback by the naked hatred in his voice, the complete absence of Christian mercy in his words. Colonel Harrison allowed the silence to stretch before speaking again. "Reverend, is it your testimony that the Apache people are not human beings deserving of basic rights under territorial and federal law?" Crane seemed to realize his mistake, but it was too late. That is not what I meant. I simply meant, I think you've made your position quite clear, Reverend. No further questions. The verdict, when it came, reflected the complex nature of justice, in a world where right and wrong were often separated by nothing more than circumstances and choices. Margaret Whitmore was found guilty of wartime treason. The evidence was too clear to dispute, but the court recommended clemency in light of her subsequent service and voluntary surrender. She was sentenced to 2 years in territorial prison with the possibility of parole for good behavior. Naiche faced more serious charges, but the court acknowledged the extenuating circumstances of his actions. He was found guilty of manslaughter rather than murder. His sentence commuted to time served, plus restriction, to a designated reservation. The Apache leader accepted this verdict with stoic dignity, understanding that it was far more merciful than he had any right to expect. As the sentences were pronounced, Agnes felt a strange sense of completion. The weight she had carried for 24 years was finally lifted, replaced by something lighter, but no less significant the knowledge that she had found the courage to face her past and choose honor over safety. Colonel Harrison's final words from the bench would be remembered long after the trial ended. This court has seen evidence of the best and worst of human nature. We have seen how fear and hatred can corrupt even the most righteous causes, and how mercy and courage can redeem even the gravest sins. Let this be a lesson to all who would seek justice in this territory, that true justice is not about punishment, but about the possibility of redemption for all who have the courage to seek it. 18 months later, Margaret Whitmore walked out of the territorial prison into a world that had changed in ways both subtle and profound. The Apache wars were winding down, replaced by a complex web of treaties and reservations that promised an uncertain peace. The frontier was becoming more civilized, but it was also losing some of the rough democracy that had made second chances possible for people like her. Sister Miriam waited outside the prison gates, older now, and marked by her experiences, but still radiant with the same compassion that had drawn her to religious service. The young woman embraced her mentor with tears of joy, chattering about the work she'd been doing during Margaret's incarceration. "I've established a clinic network throughout the territory," Miriam explained as they rode toward Tucson in a hired wagon. The territorial government provided funding after Colonel Harrison's recommendations. They want to encourage peaceful relations between all the communities. Margaret smiled, understanding the irony. Her confession and trial had accomplished what Crane's schemes never could have achieved: a grudging recognition that Apache people deserved medical care and basic human dignity. "And Naiche?" she asked. "How is he managing on the reservation?" Miriam's expression grew more serious. "It's been difficult. The reservation is smaller than what was promised, and some of the younger warriors struggle with the restrictions. But Naiche holds them together, keeps them focused on building a future rather than mourning the past." Their first stop was the clinic in Tucson, where Margaret was amazed to see Apache and Mexican patients waiting alongside Anglo settlers. The racial tensions that had once made such scenes impossible had not disappeared, but they had been tempered by practical necessity and grudging respect. "The Apache have been developing their own medical traditions," Miriam explained. Naiche arranged for several young people to study with doctors in Phoenix and Santa Fe. They're combining traditional healing with modern medicine, creating something entirely new. Margaret felt deep satisfaction at this news. The bridge between cultures that she and Miriam had tried to build was becoming self-sustaining, no longer dependent on outside charity, but growing from the strength and wisdom of the Apache themselves. But the moment she had most hoped for came 2 days later, when a familiar figure appeared at the clinic's door. Naiche stood there dressed in a mixture of traditional Apache clothing and modern Western wear. His long hair now streaked with silver, but his eyes still burning with quiet strength. "Margaret," he said formally, then smiled. "I was not certain you would want to see me after all this time." Margaret laughed, the sound bright with genuine joy. "My friends may call me whatever they choose. I'm grateful you came." They talked for hours, sharing stories of the years that had passed since their dramatic trial. Naiche spoke of the challenges of leading his people through the transition from nomadic freedom to reservation life, of the delicate balance between preserving tradition and adapting to changing circumstances. "Some of the old ways are lost forever," he admitted, his voice carrying the weight of acceptance rather than bitterness. "But others survive, and new ways are being born. My nephew's son is studying to be a doctor now. He wants to serve both Apache and white patients to help heal the wounds that still divide our peoples." Margaret nodded, understanding the profound hope contained in that simple statement. "And you? How do you find peace with all the changes?" Naiche was quiet for a moment, his dark eyes distant with memory. "I remember something you said during the trial, that redemption comes not from hiding from our mistakes, but from learning to face them. That has become my medicine, my way of understanding what we have all been through." He reached into his medicine bag and withdrew a familiar object, Margaret's worn Bible. Its pages now interleaved with pressed flowers and herbs in the Apache tradition. "I have been reading your book, trying to understand the healing it contains. Much of it speaks of forgiveness, of choosing mercy over vengeance." Margaret felt tears prick her eyes as she recognized the profound journey this man had undertaken. "And what have you concluded?" "That the strongest warrior is not the one who defeats his enemies, but the one who turns enemies into friends. That true victory comes not from conquest, but from understanding." Naiche's weathered face creased into a slight smile. "These are difficult lessons for an old war chief to learn, but perhaps that is why they are worth learning." As their conversation continued, Margaret sensed that Naiche had come for more than just a friendly visit. Finally, he broached the subject that had brought him to Tucson. "The reservation needs a doctor," he said carefully. "Someone who understands both Apache and white medicine. Someone who has proven that healing knows no boundaries of race or creed." Margaret stared at him, hardly daring to believe what she was hearing. "You're offering me a position? I am offering you a chance to complete the work you began years ago. To heal not just bodies, but the wounds between our peoples. It will not be easy. There are still those on both sides who prefer hatred to understanding." Margaret looked around the clinic at the mixed group of patients waiting for treatment, at Miriam organizing supplies with the efficient care of someone who had found her calling. This was good work, important work, but it was also work that could continue without her. What about the territorial authorities? They may not approve of an ex-convict working on the reservation. Naiche's smile was quietly triumphant. "Colonel Harrison is now the territorial military liaison. He has already approved the appointment pending your acceptance. It seems your trial convinced many people that justice and vengeance are not the same thing." The offer was everything Margaret had dreamed of, but never dared hope for a chance to serve, to heal, to build bridges between peoples who had known too much warfare and too little understanding. More than that, it was a chance to transform her greatest failure into her greatest triumph. "I accept," she said simply. Carlos Santos, now 13 and working as a translator for the territorial government, helped with the transition. The boy had grown tall and serious, marked by the loss of his brother, but strengthened by the knowledge that Miguel's death had not been in vain. He had become a bridge between communities, using his linguistic skills to help negotiate the complex web of treaties and agreements that were slowly bringing peace to the territory. The Apache reservation is different from anything you've seen, Carlos told Margaret as they prepared for the journey. It's not just a place where people live. It's a place where two worlds are learning to coexist. Sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. But it's always interesting. The reservation in the Dragoon Mountains bore little resemblance to the traditional nomadic life Naiche's people had once known. But it was something more precious. It was home. Adobe buildings mixed with traditional wiki-ups, and children played games that blended Apache customs with modern innovations. There were still tensions, still conflicts between those who wanted to embrace the white man's ways and those who clung to the old traditions, but there was also a sense of community that transcended individual differences. Margaret established her medical practice in a building that served dual purposes, Western-style treatment rooms equipped with modern instruments and traditional healing spaces, where Apache medicine men could work alongside her using herbs and ceremonies passed down through generations. The integration was not always smooth, but it was genuine, born of mutual respect rather than forced compliance. Her first major challenge came during a smallpox outbreak that threatened to devastate the reservation's population. Margaret worked around the clock, drawing on both her medical training and the traditional remedies she learned from Apache healers. The crisis brought the community together in ways that years of political negotiation had failed to achieve, as Apache grandmothers shared herbal knowledge with a white doctor who had once been branded a traitor. When the outbreak was contained with minimal casualties, the victory belonged to everyone who had participated in the healing effort. Margaret found herself formally adopted into the tribe during a ceremony that moved her to tears. A woman who had once been branded a traitor was now recognized as a protector of Apache children. The years that followed brought their share of challenges. There were conflicts with territorial authorities who questioned the reservation's semi-autonomous status, tensions with neighboring ranchers who coveted Apache land, and internal struggles within the tribe between traditionalists and those who favored greater integration with white society. But through it all, Margaret served as a bridge between worlds, translating not just languages, but cultural concepts, helping Apache leaders understand white bureaucracy, while teaching territorial officials to see Apache people as individuals rather than obstacles to development. Her greatest success came with the establishment of a medical training program that produced Apache doctors capable of serving both reservation and off-reservation communities. These young healers carried forward a synthesis of medical traditions that honored the past while embracing the future. James Naiche, the nephew, who had chosen to honor both his heritage and his mentor by taking the war chief's name, became the first Apache physician to establish a practice in Phoenix. His success opened doors for others, proving that Apache people could excel in any profession when given the opportunity. Margaret lived to see her 70th birthday celebrated with a gathering that brought together Apache elders, territorial officials, former patients, and the children of children she had helped bring into the world. The ceremony was held in the shadow of the Dragoon Mountains, where she had first encountered Naiche and his warriors decades earlier. As the sun set over the desert, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson, Margaret reflected on the journey that had brought her to this moment. She had begun as Margaret Whitmore, a frightened young woman who had compromised her principles to save her brother's life. She had hidden behind false identities and religious vows, running from a past that seemed to define her. But in the end, she had learned that redemption was not about escaping the past, but about transforming it into something meaningful. Her wartime betrayal had led her to understand the true cost of impossible choices. Her years of running had taught her the value of finally standing still. Her imprisonment had shown her the difference between justice and revenge. Naiche, now an old man whose hair had gone completely white, but whose eyes still burned with quiet wisdom, sat beside her as the stars began to appear in the darkening sky. "Do you ever regret it?" he asked quietly. "The choices you made, the prices you paid." Margaret was quiet for a long moment, considering the question with the careful thought it deserved. "I regret the mistakes I made during the war. I regret the men who died because of morphine they never received. But I don't regret the journey those mistakes set me on, because it led me here to this place, to this work, to this moment of peace." She looked around at the celebration continuing around them. Apache children playing games that blended traditional and modern elements, adults conversing in a mixture of Apache and English elders, sharing stories that would preserve their culture for future generations. I spent 24 years running from Margaret Whitmore and 20 more learning to become her again. If I had to do it all again, I hope I would have the courage to make better choices from the beginning. But I'm grateful for the grace that allowed me to make better choices eventually. Naiche nodded slowly, understanding the wisdom contained in her words. "You taught me something important, Margaret. You taught me that the strongest medicine is not the kind that heals bodies, but the kind that heals hearts. The medicine of forgiveness, of understanding, of choosing mercy over vengeance." Margaret Whitmore died peacefully in her sleep, 2 years later, surrounded by the family she had chosen and the community she had served. Her funeral was attended by hundreds of people from every walk of life who had been touched by her healing hands and generous heart. Naiche, now using a walking stick, but still commanding in his dignity, delivered the eulogy in both Apache and English. He spoke of a woman who had taught his people that courage was not the absence of fear, but the willingness to act in spite of it. "She came to us as a stranger, seeking redemption," he said, his voice carrying clearly across the assembled mourners. "But she became our sister, our healer, our teacher. She showed us that the strongest medicine is found not in bottles or herbs, but in the human heart that chooses love over hatred, understanding over ignorance, hope over despair." The grave was dug in the Apache cemetery beneath an oak tree that had stood for centuries. The headstone was simple granite, inscribed with words that captured the essence of her journey. Margaret Whitmore, healer, teacher, friend. She chose other people's lives over her own comfort. But perhaps the most fitting tribute came from Dr. James Naiche, who had established a scholarship fund in her name for Apache students pursuing medical careers. In his speech at the fund's inaugural dinner, he said simply, "She taught us that redemption is not about perfection, but about persistence. Not about avoiding mistakes, but about learning from them. Not about being worthy of grace, but about accepting it when it's offered and using it to serve others." As the years passed, Margaret's story became part of Apache oral tradition told around fires and passed down through generations. The clinic she had established continued to serve the reservation and surrounding communities, staffed by doctors trained in the tradition she had pioneered. The medical training program she had founded produced dozens of Apache physicians who carried her example into cities and towns across the Southwest. And in the Dragoon Mountains, where she had first encountered Naiche and his warriors, where she had learned the true meaning of courage and redemption. And the desert wind still whispers through the sage and juniper, carrying stories of a woman who found the strength to face her past and the wisdom to choose mercy over vengeance, healing over hatred, love over fear. Her true legacy was not the healing of bodies, important as that was, but the healing of the divide between peoples, proof that understanding is possible even across the greatest differences, and that redemption is always available to those brave enough to seek it and generous enough to share it with others. Margaret Whitmore had become exactly what she was always meant to be, not perfect, but complete. Not without flaw, but without pretense. Not a saint, but something more precious and more human. A woman who had learned that the greatest courage is not the absence of fear, but the willingness to act with love in spite of it. The desert remembers her still. and her story continues to inspire all who believe that even the gravest mistakes can be transformed into the greatest triumphs, that even the deepest wounds can heal, and that even the most impossible bridges can be built by those who refuse to accept that understanding is impossible.